Hello, everybody. We have not done one of these in a while, and I think this is one of our only episodes. Certainly, our first interview expressly about Ukraine. Today, we're joined by pretty much the perfect guest for this topic. Peter is joining us today. He's behind the Substack events in Ukraine that I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this read. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about Ukraine today.
Yeah, no, I've really been looking forward to this. And I've been reading your Substack. I don't think I have quite the mental capacity to follow everything. It is the most. There are so many fucking people involved. So I'm going to try to, from my perspective as a mildly impaired adult, we're going to try to get people who are like me and want to understand this better. We're going to try to get them on the right track today. So just to get us rolling, I guess, from my outside perspective, of everything leading up to 2022 and where we're at now, something I've always wondered is, it seemed like when Zelensky won years back, he had this gigantic mandate. Like he won by a really unbelievable margin. And he was pretty expressly, pro-peace, like pro-Minsk, enforcing the Minsk agreement and implementing it candidate, and much to the chagrin of like Western institutions. What accounts for his inability to do that and everything that happened after?
You hit me with the most
it's super
Felix.
broad.
Yeah.
It's super broad.
No. I mean, it's a fascinating question. It's kind of the most interesting question, really. I was living in Ukraine with my family at that time, and getting really interested in politics at that time as well. And lately, I've been trying to think about this and write about this, because it is this whole kind of very tragic in a sense. Why didn't it work out? But also, I mean, it was sort of obvious. Looking back, you can have the benefit of hindsight. But I mean, the thing with Zelensky is that, sure, he banked on this whole popular frustration with nationalism and this popular desire for peace. But first of all, he was always a very sort of, I guess you can say, naive or politically. He was a comedian, right? I mean, he was an actor. He didn't have experience with politics. And in terms of the content of his pro-peace platform, it was very vague. I mean, he had this famous sort of the interview that really, it became clear that he was being prepared for the presidency in late 2018. This famous interview when he famously said, like, I would speak with the devil if that's what is necessary to end the war in Ukraine. And meaning like, Putla, right? And he also... And he was asked, like, so how do you think you're going to talk with Putin? He said, well, it's simple. I'll just talk with him and tell him what we want, and he'll say what they want, and we'll come to the middle. That's what his famous words back in 2018. And so he didn't really have an understanding of, I guess, the stakes involved. He had this idea, we'll just come and talk to him, and I'll talk with him and with Putin, and it'll be fine. And that's not how Russia thinks. They have a very particular demand, specific demand, which is that Ukraine removes the part of its constitution that was put in place after 2014, stating that Ukraine will join NATO. So Ukrainian government, it put this part of the constitution that Ukraine must join NATO. This was 2017, 18 or so. And Russia wants this gone. Russia wants there to be some kind of set guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO. It won't be militarized. It won't be like an Israel in Europe that's not in NATO but still cooperates militarily and so on. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't really a matter of coming to the middle. You know what I mean? So there was that misconception. But otherwise, like that. So that's the one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that from especially 2020, 2021. Zelensky, all of these huge promises, of ending the war and of ending corruption and ending poverty, he had all these huge election promises. They obviously didn't work out. And there was COVID, and that got people really angry. and his popularity began really falling. And there were these important like regional elections at the end of 2020. And his party lost basically all these regional elections to either the so-called pro-Russian opposition party or the sort of pro-Western nationalists. Well, to them, not so much, but generally to some just other parties, not his. He got really worried. And it's essentially, he then started sanctioning all of the political opposition, both the pro-Russian, although he actually sanctioned them, and the US sanctioned them, and they got rid of their assets and so on. But he also started going after the pro-Western nationalists, although in a much sort of softer way. But what ended up happening is he had declining popularity domestically, and all these polls in 2020 and 2021 showing that it was actually like his popularity was declining. And then you had the party pushing for peace, the so-called pro-Russian party of Medvedchuk opposition platform, and they were coming second, third, sometimes even first in these polls, and also the pro-Western nationalists going up. So he had lower popularity, and he decided to essentially make a bet. And also he was pissing off the oligarchs at home, and they were doing this big coalition against him. They were tired of him sort of centralizing power and generally just tired of him. And he decided to make this bet on the West that, this is my last hope to stay in power. And he started becoming more and more, aggressive, anti-Russian, nationalistic. There were these famous, his statement about maybe Ukraine will have a nuke again and so on, and all these other things. But this was at the end of 2021. But then these are like these first two factors. Then the last interesting factor, which is kind of the most, I don't know, the sexiest, the most mysterious, is, there's a Ukrainian oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, who's a very famous, I think very appealing figure, just in how sort of deranged he is. I think a lot of Americans have heard of him as well. He's very clued in, like tight with Chabad. He built this huge, it's like the biggest Jewish center in Europe or the world in his hometown in Ukraine. He was kind of close with Trump people through Boris Epstein. Do you know this guy?
Chabad is like a huge nexus for like either Ukrainian or Russian or like Russian emigre oligarchs, like through, and you talk about this a lot, through like sort of like the Eric Prince UAE nexus.
Yeah, this sort of shit. Yeah, and but Kolomoisky was like is kind of the most powerful oligarch in Ukraine. Maybe not the richest, but it was also totally unclear how rich he was because his whole empire rested on these incredibly opaque structures, this pyramid of banks and so on. But he was as a strange guy because, he supported the 2014 Euromaidan, pro-Western, pro-NATO revolution, whatever you want to call it, because he was tired of the current president, Yanukovych, for like taking his assets, right? And he didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happened is, and this is most of the Ukrainian oligarchs did the same thing, even those that had supported Yanukovych, they ended up turning against him because the US was threatening to sanction them and so on. So they turned against Yanukovych 2014. But then by 2016, 2017, you had all of these top Ukrainian oligarchs and starting to come out in favor of rapprochement with Russia again. And Kolomoisky was leading the charge. He had this important interview with the New York Times as well, which came out in 2019. But he was already saying stuff like 2016. And even the supposedly pro-Western oligarchs, like Viktor Pinchuk, who's a very sort of, he's like a Ukrainian Soros. He funds the same things that Soros funds or funded. But he actually came out in support of the Minsk agreements, these peace agreements that would return the separatist territories to Ukraine, but they would have their own political rights. And the liberal nationalists, they really, really hated these agreements. They were like, we can never implement them because they would result in the strengthening of anti-NATO, pro-Russian political forces in Ukraine. And that was not something they wanted. And it would make joining the EU impossible and so on. But anyway, but Kolomoisky came out supporting this. And that's also when he started deciding to push Zelensky, because Zelensky is Kolomoisky's creation. And Zelensky worked at Kolomoisky's TV company for his whole life, 1+1. And it was Kolomoisky's advertising of Zelensky in 2018 that got him the presidency. And this was, everyone is pretty obvious because, Kolomoisky was tired of the existing president taking his assets, kind of a classic story. But very importantly, Kolomoisky was very angry at the West because basically the West, even though it sort of used his help in 2014, it quickly turned on him. And it started trying to take away his business empire, the Privatbank crazy business empire. The IMF would always ask for Ukraine to nationalize this bank because Kolomoisky was in charge. And then the US ended up putting sanctions against him in 2021. But the important thing here is that this is where it really leads into US politics. And hopefully I'm not sort of losing the listeners a bit too much, but is that Kolomoisky played a big role in sort of anti-Biden, pro-Trump activity. Because in the whole, there were these important leaks in Ukraine in 2020 about the Burisma stuff. Kolomoisky was in contact with Rudy Giuliani, and these were these things about Biden pressuring the Ukrainian president to get rid of the general prosecutor and so on. It was a very big thing in Ukraine.
Yeah, and this was pertaining to the investigation of Burisma, the company where Hunter Biden was on the board, and he was making something like $60,000 a month, I believe, which I always thought the thing about that was so interesting because people were like, no, there's absolutely like nothing going on there. Hunter just really knows a lot about like liquid natural gas. I mean, to me, it was just like, aren't these the sort of jobs that like the shitty son of like a vice president has?
Absolutely. I mean, like, I think the Hunter thing, I mean, obviously it's obvious nepotism and so on, but it wasn't just the Hunter thing. There were like very big issues at stake. I mean, one of them was this thing where Biden pressured ex-President Poroshenko to fire the general prosecutor of Ukraine because this general prosecutor was looking into the Burisma stuff, and also just because he wasn't compliant enough with the U.S. sort of neoliberal plans. And this has been a big thing. I mean, the U.S. has forever been engaged in this long struggle with Ukrainian sort of institutions, the court system, and so on. But I mean, there were lots of things involved in this. And not only that, but Kolomoisky had this big conflict with the sort of the pro-Western NGOs and so on that they themselves played a huge role in the Manafort thing. I mean, they fired the original shot in the Manafort thing in 2016 because they released this information supposedly demonstrating Manafort's his ties with different Russian, old Ukrainian figures and so on. And these were the pro-Western NGOs that had a big problem with Kolomoisky. And then Kolomoisky, Zelensky's first presidency was seen as very dominated by Kolomoisky figures, like the original part of his presidency. But it was also mixed in with pro-Western figures. It was fairly complicated. But they started looking into the illegality of the 2016 Ukrainian participation in the Manafort thing. Because the thing is that Ukrainian courts already in 2018-19 had shown that the Manafort stuff was essentially fake or unprovable, and it was illegal for the Ukrainian organizations should not have dragged Ukraine into U.S. politics. It was very bad for Ukraine to get involved in this. So anyway, so there's that whole thing. Kolomoisky really pissed off Biden, and when Biden came in charge, the Washington Post reported that Biden wanted Zelensky to get rid of Kolomoisky, and it was clear that sort of the Ukrainian kind of oligarchs, they wanted some kind of détente with Russia, get trade going again. They were scared of war because obviously the war has destroyed their assets, totally destroyed them. Kolomoisky's now in jail. Zelensky put him in jail in 2023. This huge fall from this meteoric sort of rise. And Zelensky's centralized his power so much in wartime. So it's this very interesting, complicated. There was a significant sort of intrigue, I guess, attempt to come to some sort of agreement with Russia from the Zelensky government, from Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky had his people going to Moscow in 2020, 2019. And the Zelensky government did restart negotiations with Russia in 2019, 2020, that previous government had cut off since essentially 2016, 2017. So there was this attempt, and then there was a lot of different I mean, the different pro-Western NGOs, they did lots of protests. Like they had this 2019 red lines that they released. Nothing that could harm NATO entry, which obviously is the main Russian demand. And then the nationalist groups, they protested. But there is also this kind of subterranean element of like Kolomoisky's own failure in diplomacy and his getting on the wrong side of the U.S. administration. It's a very interesting question. But I mean, basically, it was this NATO question, and it went from there. But in terms of the timing and the context, it's a very interesting question.
Again, very limited perspective on my part, but like the trajectory of Zelensky's administration and fortunes, it seemed like a pretty familiar tale in contemporary electoral politics, right? Where there is an outsider branded, generally kind of like populist anti-corruption candidate who their plans are quite vague sounding, but they're generally things that are like, popular positions that previous administrations or figures did not have like the will or the resources to implement. And it's this sort of, I hate to be one of these people that compares everything to U.S. politics, but sort of a similar theory to the Bernie theory of 2020, where it's like we're going to activate all the people who didn't vote before, and that will be like our base of support for these incredibly difficult things. And usually these things end with their ideas are too vague. They don't really have any plans beyond that. That was certainly what seemed like happened with Zelensky. You wrote about the negotiations starting out with prisoner exchanges, but not really going any farther than that. And when I read those interviews that you quoted from in those articles, yeah, it just seemed like he just had campaign talk. The thing that's weird and I think unique to Ukraine is where it went from there. Because usually those are like one, if they're lucky, 2-term leaders, or, if they're in a parliamentary system, they don't stick around for that long. They go on to like write a book and do the think tank circuit, depending on their alignment. But weirdly enough, here he is. He's fucking still around. I guess going from there, because that was a really great explanation of kind of what happened and why. I was wondering if you could give the listeners sort of an accounting of, as you see it, two of the most important factions in Ukrainian politics that you identify as sort of the grant eaters, the Sorosites, and the more hardline nationalists. Even though the grant eaters, of course, as you explain, are also nationalists, but the more, I guess, if I were Ezra Klein, I would say a liberal types compared to the grant eaters.
Yeah. I mean, these terms, by the way, these are like not really, I didn't make them up. No one can blame me. This is a Ukrainian Russian term, Sorosites, Sarasiata, which sounds like piglets. It's a funny joke. It sounds really funny in Russian and Ukrainian. Anyway, but these are people that are funded by the, International Renaissance Foundation, Open Society Foundation, George Soros. And in the U.S., Soros is a bit of a, a whistle. What's that phrase in English? Like a
whistleblower?
No, whistleblower. But it's like, this guy's a Nazi. He says this term,
Oh, dog whistle.
Dog whistle. That's right. But the thing is, my family, they were deep in Soros money, right? They met with the guy a bunch of times. And this is lots of political people in this part of the world. This guy played a huge role in the political life of these countries. So anyway, and these people are funded by these organizations. Anyway, and also obviously
yeah, sorry to interrupt, but that is, God, I remember this sort of like left liberal reporter I knew made this post around like 2020 where he's like, George Soros is this amazing guy and he's spending the twilight of his life being called all these awful things. And it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, he isn't like the more ridiculous things that like right wingers in America have been saying since like the 90s are obviously crazy, and saying that he was like a fucking capo when he was 5 years old is like incredibly stupid and awful. But I'm sorry, you don't make like 30 billion fucking dollars as a currency trader and you're just, I just want what's best for everyone. Like he clearly, he's very interested in global politics. He has an articulated idea for what that should look like. And yeah, it's not dog whistle to point out that it's a documented fact that he is very involved in the politics of like a lot of these countries.
And I mean, like these organizations in Ukraine, I mean, they play a huge role. I mean, as I was saying, in 2019, right, Zelensky is elected, and all the Sorosites, they hate Zelensky. They think he's a Russian agent. He's going to he's going to stop Ukraine joining NATO, joining the EU. This is awful. And they put out this document, these red lines. So you got, the president cannot cross these red lines. It's like, who are you? You know, you're a bunch of unelected NGOs funded by foreign governments, right? I mean, like, who are you? I mean, it's one thing if these organizations exist, sure. And it's still, I mean, in most countries, I mean, not most countries, actually, in most countries there are, but in wealthy countries and powerful countries, you don't have many foreign funded organizations running around. It's one thing if they exist, but if you're putting red lines on the elected president with, 70% of the vote, it's very strange. And I mean, they play a huge role. I mean, they have a very simple, clear politics. It's this hardcore economic neoliberalism, privatize everything, put us in charge of the supervisory councils of these privatized husks of the state-owned enterprises, and will, supervise their destruction while getting huge salaries. This is a common career path of many Sorosites like Sergei Leshchenko, Staffan Naim, and so on. And then we're going to laugh and make fun of the sort of ordinary Ukrainians, who we call to be like pro-Russian bydlo, which means cattle. It's a common term by like post-Soviet liberals to refer to, the majority of the population is this idea, this kind of Orwell night Big Brother. They're these stupid cattle who follow the communist, general line, and they can't be trusted with democracy, right? Anyway, I mean, we can talk about Sorosites. There's lots that can be said about the Sorosites. But they're like the most nationalist sector of Ukrainian society. And I mean, calling them a sector of society is a little bit of a stretch, because I mean, it's a very small portion. It's like less than 5%, 2%, something. Very, very small group of people. But who have been pumped, a lot of money has been pumped into them over the decades. But they're the most nationalist. And the thing is, like, they don't fight at the front line. And there was this really, they don't fight in the war at all, really. There was a famous law the cabinet put out late last year, which actually exempted 133 NGOs and their employees from mobilization in the war. And obviously mobilization is a huge issue in Ukraine. Latest news yesterday, another person tried to kill himself at the mobilization office, cutting his wrists with a key, because he got mobilized and put in this dungeon and sent to the front, right? I mean, happens every day. I have my friends hiding at home for over a year, 2 years now, not leaving the home because they'll get mobilized and thrown to the front. And they have no money. He can't go to the dentist. So he's got this awful tooth problem. He can't go to the dentist. This is because if you go to the doctor, it's very common. You can get mobilized there. It's an insane, awful situation, right? But then you have these Sorosite thought leaders, like this guy, Vitaly Portnikov. And he recently gave this interview saying how we can't mobilize everyone because that's feudalism. In feudalism, you had, everyone fighting but in democracy, like some kind of bullshit, which
I remember this because it really stuck out to me. He said, if you want the aristocracy to die while fighting in the war, okay, well, then we'll have a feudal system, because that's what happens in feudalism. But in democracy, the common man dies, which is like, what a fucking incredible thing to say.
Yeah. And then you had this thing that exempted them from mobilization, which is kind of a funny inversion of feudalism, because in feudalism, the nobility had to fight. This was kind of their purpose. But now, one Ukrainian politician called it a new nobility, but it's a paradoxical one where they're exempted from fighting. I mean, it's also funny if you look at this list because it was published like this list on and among the organizations exempted, it's Deloitte. Their employees don't have to fight. There's like
Oh
10
my
different.
God.
There's like 10 different Deloitte forms of Deloitte that are exempted. I wrote a big article about it. That there's a bunch of very Raytheon employees are exempted from fighting. The Kiev School of Economics, which is this hyper neoliberal libertarian like group of researchers, you can call them that. These weird biolab companies, AFL-CIO, American, Black and Veatch, which is this weird, biolab company. Anyway, so they're freaks. They're awful. They don't fight in the war, and they always have scandals about them avoiding service. But they also want the war to continue forever because, without Ukraine being this NATO frontline state, they're not going to get any funding, right? That's the whole purpose. That's the reason why they get funding, and they don't have to face the risks of fighting. And they also have they play very important roles in the Ukrainian government. They don't play important roles, but they occupy important posts in the Ukrainian government. Like Sergei Leshchenko, who was the guy who published the original stuff about Manafort back in 2016, which led to the whole Manafort saga. He's actually one of Zelensky's top advisors, official advisors, which is another reason why Trump obviously isn't very well disposed towards Zelensky. Rudy Giuliani really hates this guy, for instance. He had lots of statements like Leshchenko's the worst guy in the world. But then you also have the Azov people. I mean, I wouldn't say that Azov is one of the most. I mean, there's kind of a lot of factions in Ukrainian politics. It's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy. I mean, lots of countries, I guess, but Ukraine in particular, it's very exciting. Lots of things going on. The Azov guys are definitely powerful and influential, but often they do. I think they may exaggerate. I mean, because they're obviously also working with other influential forces in Ukrainian politics. But the Azov guys, these are the classic, Ukrainian nationalist, neo-Nazi, pagan. They're all into all kinds of freaky stuff. People fighting in the army, and they've become huge in wartime. They've now just announced that they're moving to a corps. They were previously like a battalion, a group of brigades, but now they've unified into this huge, larger structure, and they've been recently given a lot more control of the front lines. And they're considered to be, the most effective fighters in the army, and they always drum this up, and they have huge PR support. So much, military, like they get the best weapons, the best training, and everyone wants to join them. I mean, if you want to join the army, then you want to join Azov. And I know people that ended up joining Azov that I used to fucking go out and drink with and get fucked up with, but now they're in Azov. It's lots of hipsters go there. It's because, if you have money, you go there. But they're freaks, right? I mean, they're into real esoteric pagan Nazi shit and all that sort of thing. Yeah,
that's interesting. You said like hipsters showing it.
Yeah,
is it sort of like a, I don't know, like a middle class adventurism, or like it's sort of like a coming of age thing? I don't know. This is more of like a war on terror thing, but that was a phenomenon that you would see in America. Middle class strivers enlisted, and not just enlisting or joining as officers, but like trying to join more elite units like Rangers.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of talked with or did like interviews with different right-wing, like neo-Nazi sort of people back in Ukraine. And almost all of them, they're like coders and so. And coders is I don't know, I think in the US it's not so much of a thing, but in Eastern Europe, coders are this really important class in society because they earn way more than everyone else. And they work for foreign companies, and they earn just huge amounts more than everyone else. But also, they're not actually rich enough to actually move to Western Europe, because Ukrainian wages are so much lower and so on. And so they have this complicated, they simultaneously kind of hate the rest of society. They think they're a bunch of ignorant losers and sort of idiots, right? Stupid working class cattle, right? But they also, and they love the West. They want to go to the West, but they kind of can't go there. So they have kind of a bit of an identity issue. But in general, yeah, it is this Azov is this striving. They're really sexy. They've made an anime now. They have like some anime guy.
Oh my God. Everyone has fucking
Yeah.
anime now in the 2020s.
They make these really slick ads that are like 2-minute anime mini movies and stuff. But they do have. I remember I met this random guy who joined us. He wasn't a hipster. He was just a random sort of poor countryside guy. But he left because he got freaked out seeing dead people and so on. So this before 2021 or so. But it is the striving thing. I remember I talked with this other Nazi coder guy, and he was like, many of us are coders. We're trying to find ourselves, realize ourselves in life. And I mean, they came out of also like football hooligan scene, which is also this kind of subculture-y, I guess like middle class revolt type thing, very like also anarchist symbolism that then gets converted like anti-government, but then like, anyway, it's interesting. But the last thing about the Azov guys is just that they more and more are actually coming out in favor of a ceasefire, which is quite interesting because they are worried that, because I mean, they're also the ones dying and fighting in the war, unlike the, Soros type people. And, but they also, are in the army and they can see that the, Ukrainian army is losing territory, but they're very worried the Ukrainian army is kind of just going to collapse essentially of its disorganization and, or just in the long term that the Russian army will win. And also they worry about the growth of pro-Russian sentiments. I sort of translate lots of this. They're like analytical stuff that I translate on my Substack, where they worry that this hardcore, forever, endless war, mobilization, poverty is just is increasing pro-Russian sentiment in Ukrainian society. And then that just, the whole project will fail. So lots of them are calling for a ceasefire, and they're very actively criticizing the Soros people, obviously saying the Soros people are like, LGBT, blah, blah. But just also that you guys are totally irresponsible and you're dooming our state. So that's an interesting conflict that's going on. And the Azov people are definitely sort of allied with other forces as well. And we can also talk about different sort of intrigues that, well, they're probably trying to talk with the Trump and different other figures in the Ukrainian political world that are definitely talking with Trump. They're also close with Azov. So that's definitely a possibility that if they worry that Zelensky and the Soros people, who are kind of more and more closer, even though just because they both share a need for forever war, even though they sort of hate each other in many other ways, but in that sense they agree, then the logical sort of replacement would be some sort of coalition of, Azov patriotic young officers, and then some older figures from the political sphere that have also been in contact with Trump, and some newer figures. We can talk about that a bit as well. It's happening right now. It's interesting. But anything else?
Before we get into that, I really want to get into the deal and what the future looks like. But the last one or two things I wanted to talk about before that were the final. As you said, there are a billion factions and sub-factions, but one of the most interesting, influential factions that you talked about, sort of as going over the main forces, both during Zelensky's rise and now, were the oligarchs that in Western media are identified as pro-Russia. And you make this point that it isn't always, or even usually, that someone is pro-Russia in Ukraine. It's that they either, by taking a sober look at things, or because of their vested interests, such as these oligarchs that you're talking about, realize that a war would mean, obviously, hundreds of thousands of dead. For the oligarchs, it would mean that their interests, especially the ones that have interests in, rare metals or metallurgical concerns, that it would be extremely deleterious to their interests. If you could talk a little bit about that, and also I'm sorry, this is so broad, but like the other thing that I found incredibly interesting was you talked a lot about Ukrainian industries that were sort of vestiges of like either old Soviet design bureaus or state-owned companies, the newer ones that were sort of like ripped apart and like forbidden from doing business with Russia, who would kind of be like their obvious main customer for military aviation, which was Ukraine had a lot of potential for a pretty big military aviation industry. I was wondering if, I guess, like after all of this, what would be left? Like what could they do business with, and what is left for that oligarch faction that you talked about now after all this?
Yeah, I mean, so the second question is that, I mean, Ukraine was, in a sense, like the most highly industrialized part of the Soviet Union, and the most advanced most technologically advanced parts of the Soviet, supply chain were in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, which is where Kolomoisky is from, and the area where Zelensky is from as well. But and you had factories like Motor Sich, which is in that area as well, not in that particular city, which was a very important aviation aeronautics factory, over 100 years old, played a huge role in like the first Soviet helicopters and the first helicopters in the world as well, in World War One. Anyway, incredibly important factory, and Russia actually depended on it in the post-Soviet world for its own helicopters and planes, which was sort of a problem for Russia. Russia tried to sort of diversify away from that in the 2000s because they realized that Ukraine was going down this pro-Western path, and it would not really be possible to depend on them for this. But still, Russia was their main partner for this, and then the owner of this factory was quite positive, like pro-Russian, positive for trade integration with Russia. But he also had his limits. He also criticized Russia, for they basically trade competition with him. So it's always with these Ukrainian businessmen that they're not. None of them are really ideologically aligned with Russia, or whatever. And throughout the 2000s period, they actually, even though they were seen as pro-Russian by the pro-Western opposition, they actually crushed idealistically pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine that had their own little organizations and so on. They got put down because these oligarchs, they didn't like competition and other reasons as well. And they also just didn't want to become part of Russia, because if they're part of Russia, then they have to compete with the Russian businessmen, which are bigger than them. So they never really wanted that. They just wanted to continue trading with Russia, right? And but then when 2014, the Euromaidan moving towards the EU and cutting off trade with Russia, and there's war in the East and so on. And because of this, like Motor Sich, like their sales fell by 40%, and the factory entered this long period of crisis. And then the Chinese tried to get it, and then the Trump administration blocked that. Eric Prince tried to get it. It's a big story. But in wartime, this factory's been bombed many times by the Russians, because obviously it's a military industrial factory. It's kind of what number one target in a war. But just in general, I mean, I have these sort of statistics I can read out quickly about sort of Ukraine. It deindustrialized very significantly. Throughout the post-Soviet period, but in particular after 2014, when the Euromaidan won, and the whole aim was to sign this free trade agreement with the EU, which was a very one-sided one, kind of a similar kind of NAFTA type stuff, although. Sort of from a Mexican perspective, but really much worse, because in fact, the free trade agreement that Ukraine signed with the EU, it didn't really allow any industrial exports by Ukraine to the EU, because they had to comply to these very stringent EU, health, all these different requirements.
And I mean, for military aviation, there's no chance that the fucking EU, like that Dassault or Dassault.
Yeah.
I'm never going to try to pronounce anything ever again. I should be
the French.
fucking killed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, any of the big Western European existing defense contractors.
Yeah.
That was the big thing that I thought, like, they're never going to, like, even what's left of Antonov, they would never let that.
Yeah. No, and it like the whole factory just collapsed. Antonov factory actually became like an Azov base, which was pretty crazy. I had like a garage around there, and I'd always
that
run
says
around
it all,
there.
doesn't it?
It was real freaky. Yeah, but it was just kind of collapsing, this big Azov sign there and stuff. But I mean, what happened was that the like, for instance, like the GDP, just the share of the industrial production just kept on falling. It fell by 4% from what was it, from 2012, 2019. And these statistics, I mean, like, for instance, like automobile production, it was a third of its 2012 level in 2019. So it fell by 3 times. Same with train wagons and metallurgical production. They all had these huge falls. There were all these domestic exports of aerospace production declined by 5 times over the 5-year period in 2013, 2019, 6-year period. Train wagons exports fell by 7.5 times. So these huge falls in the most industrially advanced sections of the Ukrainian economy. There are all these big car factories, and the huge car factory in Zaporizhia just collapsed. Doesn't exist anymore, really. And instead, Ukraine became this agricultural exporter to the EU. But even then, like, they couldn't even export that much there were these strict quotas in the EU free trade agreement, which meant that beyond the quotas, the tariffs would come back. So it was a very disadvantageous agreement that the EU signed with Ukraine. The Ukrainian government occasionally tried to renegotiate it, and it would just always fail. The EU just told them, no, we don't need to. In wartime, the restrictions got loosened significantly, even removed. But obviously, I mean, it's wartime, and Ukraine couldn't really produce much at all anyway. And then even then, the EU farmers, they had all the big protests against it, and it's in the process. Lots of the restrictions were came back and so on. But like, the Zelensky government at the beginning tried to actually introduce some protectionist measures to save industry. But this was actually vetoed by the Sorosite, different NGOs, also the EU and the US Chamber of Commerce. They vetoed it. And because, I mean, Ukraine's state purchases, 40% of them are from foreign companies, which is a huge, huge amount compared to like the US, the EU, where it's 2 to 5%. But then you had these neoliberal NGOs that just blocked it. So I guess that's the situation. I mean, yeah, in the future, there's very, very little to no hope for the industrial complex. And it's one of the ironic things where it's like, Ukraine was positioned as this Russian militaries at a spearhead that was going to fight against Russia, and ended up fighting against Russia. But its military industrial base was eroded over this period by the same, Western forces that were preparing it for this role. And in wartime, they haven't been able to set up, for instance, like a shell factory. Lots of the Azov telegrams complain about this a lot. Like, why don't we have a single shell factory in Ukraine? They can make drones, but these are small, quite technologically basic items in small little garages and small different other locations around the country. And they are making quite a few of them, but still much less than the Russians are making with their drones. And then I think your first question was about the oligarchs, right? Like, their position.
Yeah, the oligarchs that, like, they would be labeled as pro-Russian in Western media, but that really they wanted to prevent a war at all costs and wanted the implementation of Minsk. And, like, however politically, like, fractious that environment would be, it would be much better than this.
Yeah, I mean, like, they have all lost billions of dollars, according to, like, Washington Post. Like, Akhmetov, the richest guy in Ukraine, he just lost billions of dollars. His own fortune was on like 6 billion. Now it's like 2 or 3 billion. His factories were the key sort of points of the war, like Azovstal in Mariupol. That was his factory, one of his biggest assets. But anyway, I mean, so they've lost a lot, but it is also, I mean, they were in pretty deep with the Atlanticists as well. I mean, Akhmetov and Pinchuk, this other big oligarch, Pinchuk also called for some kind of Minsk implementation in 2016, for which he was criticized heavily by the NGO people and liberal nationalists. But I mean, they're some of the biggest funders of the Atlantic Council, which is this very important, like, ultra-Atlanticist, Washington headquartered think tank, which is, we can talk about Atlantic Council as well. It's pretty interesting topic with its sponsors and so on, but they're like incredibly hawkish and so on about confronting Russia and blah blah. So I mean, these guys, Akhmetov and Pinchuk, who were the richest guys in the country. They sort of tried to play both sides, and it did seem like possible that maybe the U.S. would force Ukraine to implement Minsk in the pre-2022 period. This was actually even in 2022 in January, and in late 2021 there was this huge like paranoia in Ukraine by the Ukrainian government and by the liberal nationalists that Biden would force Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements in order to focus on China and come to agreement with Russia. I mean, I hope that would be the case as well, but it became clear that was not going to happen. But so those oligarchs, their power has been very much eroded in wartime anyway, but they still have plenty of power for sure.
Yeah,
the Zelensky group has emerged. There's this new sort of power vertical, although I think as well like the days are fairly numbered. It's hard to see them surviving much longer. But Kolomoisky is in jail, but he's still scheming very much. He came out with an announcement. Like now that Trump's back, he has lots of hopes that he's going to be able to sort of return. And the thing is that this is also a really important factor in Zelensky being really worried about a ceasefire because, this is kind of getting into the current talks and so on. But I mean, what Russia wants and what Trump is also saying that he wants is for there to be elections in Ukraine. Obviously, like an end to military hostilities and some kind of even, long-term peace in Ukraine, and elections to replace Zelensky. And the reason that Zelensky really fears this, other than, obviously it's nice to be in power, but I mean, as I was saying before, his whole, like in 2021, his popularity fell, but then he relied on the West to be as this sort of anti-Russian warrior and so on. Mm-hmm. And he was able to continue being president, even though his popularity became very low. But then in the wartime, it became higher at the beginning. But then his legitimacy by the Constitution ended in May of 2024. That was when his second term ended. And in the Ukrainian Constitution, you can't have more than 2 terms. But more importantly, he's pissed off Kolomoisky so much. I mean, like, Kolomoisky is a really serious guy. I mean, like, let me just read this great kind of quote that I found from this other Ukrainian politician who lived in the same city as Kolomoisky. He has this great thing about Kolomoisky. He says, "I don't know how this will end. Kolomoisky has a saying he likes to repeat. Life is like a supermarket. You walk through, pick the most beautiful things, try them, load up your cart, and enjoy them. But at the end of the road, there's a checkout counter, and you have to pay for everything you took." That's the Kolomoisky line. But then this guy that knew Kolomoisky, he says, "I know that Kolomoisky has a personal cemetery in Dnipropetrovsk, his home city, full of people whose businesses were seized by him and who were killed. If you gathered them all, you have an entire graveyard." So, I mean, like, he tried to assassinate, like, the head of the Ukrainian National Bank in 2018. That was a big thing. He's killed a lot of people. This guy has a shark tank. I just want to make this clear. This guy had a shark tank, like in his office. Kolomoisky had this tank with sharks swimming around it. This is in the New York Post article about him. So this is a really serious guy. He's a very funny guy. He's quite Trumpian in a much more sort of crazy, chaotic, evil way. He had this great joke, for instance, where it's unconstitutional in Ukraine to have more than one citizenship, and he has 2. Everyone knows that he has Ukrainian and Israeli. But then he was asked about this by a journalist, and he had this great laugh. And he says, "Well, look, actually, I have 3 citizenships. I have Cypriot, Israeli, and Ukrainian, and there's no law against having 3 citizenships in the Ukrainian Constitution." So,
that is a very Trump line.
Exactly. I mean, he's got so many zingers. He's an endless source of entertainment. But he's a very, very, very serious guy, and Zelensky has taken all of his businesses, put him in jail, right? It's crazy, and Zelensky in general has really kind of a bit of so much extortion in wartime. I mean, this was so many businesses are really complaining about how just constant, either you pay the rent or you get accused of supporting Russia, of being a Russian agent, and so of financing terrorism. Kolomoisky's business partner, Bogolyubov, who escaped to the EU, he stated in an interview that the government in Ukraine demanded he pay $100 million or he go to jail, that he managed to escape. So, I mean, like, Zelensky has so many enemies, more enemies than is possibly imaginable. Already in 2021, all the oligarchs were against him, and now they just hate him. So he is very worried about his personal safety, and this is a big. And if there was democracy, elections, he would be in serious, serious danger. So I guess hopefully that sort of answers your question. I'm gonna maybe it didn't.
Yeah. I want to get into the Atlantic Council and just sort of like the Western forces as they relate to all these factions. Something that's so interesting to me about this is, you know, initially I made this offhanded remark that a lot of Western interplay with Ukrainian factions and industry is sort of, it seems almost like they formalized and codified a lot of, you know, what similar groups did in Russia in the 90s. But really, like, you know, not to say what happened there was necessarily lesser or okay, but at least when the same Western forces were doing this in the 90s in Russia, they were looting all these companies and looting all these former state concerns, but with the implicit understanding that they would own like a part of an aluminum company or a weapons manufacturer or something. Basically, that these things would exist. In Ukraine, it's just anything that could possibly compete with any of these sort of state champion EU companies is just purposely let to rot or taken apart. And anything that survives is, you know, to be carved up and given to, you know, an Eric Prince type, possibly. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like kind of worse and like more cynical than Russia in the 90s, actually.
Yeah, I mean, Russia also, you know, deindustrialized massively in that time. But I think that I do agree with you in that what's happened in Ukraine is they've been able to sort of get in charge of the state a lot more than in Russia. And this has been a really long-term process. I mean, for decades with the US, Canada, and the EU sponsoring all these NGOs, a very long project with them marching to the institutions, in cultural institutions, but then also in the court system. This has been ongoing for decades, getting all these different court observers, pollsters, which then played a huge role in all these different kind of, you know, revolutions, quote unquote, but also all these different supervisory councils, ethics committees, like for instance, of the courts, of the judges. There's this big thing in the past couple of years under Zelensky that was put through under huge opposition from Ukraine's court system that put these supervisory council, which has to be minimum half foreigners. And right now there's like a Lithuanian and a Texan guy and some other, I think a Brussels person or something, who's has the deciding vote in choosing Ukrainian judges, right, for the future. And this is huge because, I mean, often, and these guys, the old Ukrainian court system, which still exists, like these court figures, they'll often kind of do things like declare that the privatization of agricultural land is unconstitutional. That was a big scandal. And the Western, pro-Western people are really angry about that. Or they'll declare that like these anti-corruption organizations that were set up by the US in Ukraine in 2014-15, that they're unconstitutional, which is true because they have all these rights which are not, there's no place in the Constitution for these weird organizations, anti-corruption institutions that can gather info on any politician and that can send them to jail and can investigate them and so on and so on. And that outside of the purview of the Supreme Court and so on. So anyway, so that's a big thing really, where they've been able to really put the state machinery under their control, get their people in really high places, and not just people that are like sympathetic to, you know, liberalization or whatever, but people that just straight up were educated in the US and that worked their whole lives in US funded NGOs. Like that didn't really happen as much in Russia. You had pro-liberalization people like, Gaidar and so on. But these were people from kind of the Soviet, I guess, from the Soviet era. And lots of them ended up cooperating with Putin anyway. Some of them were even still in the Russian government. Some of them left after 2022. But then in Ukraine, you have this new class that was created of, you know, so-called Sorosites and so on, that are really, and just foreigners that have these important posts in these different companies. So I do think it is different for sure. And maybe we could talk about Atlantic Council a bit.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that. Could you talk a little bit or however much about how I guess their Ukraine business, you would call it, got rolling. And I am kind of interested in the future of it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess that there were two. It's like, I guess, three interesting sort of little things. The thing, I guess, to make clear is that this would happen was known a long time ago, right? That there would be this big war and so on. I mean, there was this famous declassified, well, not declassified, WikiLeaks released it, of this 2008 letter from William Burns, who is the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time. And he stated that, if Ukraine joins NATO, Russia will view this expansion as a military threat. And all sections of the Russian establishment agree on this, and there could be war. Russia would have to intervene and so on. And he advised against any sort of moves towards Ukraine joining NATO, which were precisely beginning at that time, 2008. But by, there was the conference and so on in Munich, as I recall. And but then you also had like this another thing that's often brought up, which is quite interesting reading, is this 2019 RAND report called "Extending Russia: Competing from Advantageous Ground." And there's this whole chapter there about like the main geopolitical measure that they see is providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And I mean, they say some pretty interesting things there. Like, one of the big things they talk about is how it's difficult to separate Europe from Russia, and they say that reducing European peacetime consumption of Russian gas has a median for low likelihood of success. And I think the key word here is peacetime, right? Because in wartime, that has been possible. Although, I mean, Europe still consumes quite a lot of Russian gas, but still, they got the Europeans to put through sanctions on to stop using Nord Stream 2, and then also it got destroyed, obviously. And this was also one of the sort of key tensions in 2021, where Nord Stream was finished around that time. And then there was this big thing of how will the U.S. respond? Are they going to let it exist? It seemed like they just let it exist. But this has been a really long-term American key policy goal of, this whole idea of the Eurasian, right, landmass. We can't let Russia and Europe link up. If that happens, then there's no more need. Europe won't need the U.S. anymore. What role will the U.S. have in the world? And, and you had, in the 80s, you had, Reagan fighting against European Russian gas expansion, right? You also had a strange explosion as well of Russian gas infrastructure that's some link to the U.S. government back in the 80s. So, I mean, and this RAND document actually brings this up. They say that the Reagan attempt to stop it. So, like, this policy would require both planning to make sure that it's efficient as possible and cost sharing to make sure that all countries would benefit and would also have an incentive to participate. Because the problem was that the most important flaw is that new non-Russian gas supplies for Europe would be more expensive than continuing to purchase Russian pipeline gas. But in wartime, the Europeans have been forced to buy this more expensive American gas. But the whole thing is, if the war ends, then that'll stop. So, I mean, and that's been a major, there's often discussion of, like, to what extent has the war in Ukraine been beneficial for the U.S. government, the U.S. sort of state interests. And in this respect, it was successful, right? I mean, it got them to switch to the American gas. It got them to cut off so many ties with Russia and depend on the U.S. so much more. And maybe I think there's this extent to which the American government was just worried that if we let this continue any further, then it's over. Then they'll just be really reintegrating with Russia, just as the Ukrainian business elite wanted to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And but they also say in this report that increasing military aid would certainly drive up the Russian cost, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. This would generally be seen as a serious setback for U.S. policy. So, I mean, it was fairly obvious, the cost as well. And they compared it to Afghanistan, how that was great. This would be great as well. But anyway, I mean, so that was foreseen quite in many ways. And also, if you look at Ukrainian media, they were predicting it as well. Back in 2019, Zelensky's top advisor, Arestovich, he stated that there would definitely be a war with Russia in 2020 to 2022. unless Ukraine gave up NATO admission. So I mean, it was clear. Then you have Atlantic Council. We get to Atlantic Council, which is this very influential think tank centered in Washington. Atlantic Council, it was set up in 1961 as this, obviously, pro-NATO think tank. But in terms of the funders, they publish their funders every year. Their biggest government funder is actually the UK, not the US, which is interesting. And I think that does point to this whole sort of Atlanticist special agreement, special relationship where the UK is particularly interested in keeping the US involved in European affairs, if we can put it that way. And the UK wants to sort of reclaim this lost kind of imperial power that it had, this whole Russian kind of obsession, and trying to keep the US involved. But some other funders, according to the website, is Ukrainian businessman Rinat Akhmetov, Viktor Pinchuk, Raytheon, Amazon, FedEx, Lockheed Martin, Open Society Foundation of Albania, also the Open Society Foundation in general, Walmart, Lithuania, Estonia, Australian Foreign Intelligence, Elbit Systems, Israeli military industrial.
Famous Israeli.
Yeah. Palo Alto Networks, which is this weird sort of tech military industrial thing. Penguin Random House, Omidyar Network, AGC Global Jewish Advocacy, U.S. State Department, Palantir, Google, Airbus, Rockefeller Foundation, the UAE, UK Foreign Service, Goldman Sachs, ExxonMobil, Department of Defense, American, Apple, Tellurian, which is a U.S. LNG company, natural gas, which is obviously competing with Russian LNG, Thales, which is this other military industrial company, NATO. My favorite one, though, is that Romania donated, but it was under $1,000.
What's even the point? That what? Did they buy a coffee in the lobby?
Yeah, and there's this section because they divide the funding by how much they donated, and above $1 million, below below 100,000, and then there's the section below $1,000. And all of the people here, it's just individuals, right? Like Alex Jones, or whatever, And then there's Romania, government of Romania, which is the only sort of non-individual in this huge list of. Anyway.
That's so funny. I first sort of not caught wind of them, but sort of I don't know, started paying more attention to them during the Syrian civil war, especially around 2014, because they were. Do you remember this guy, Mike Morrell, former CIA director, who was a big, Hillary 2016 figure? He's a think tank fixture, and he would be on, shows like Charlie Rose, pre-cancellation. And he's done some TV about Ukraine, though Syria is more of his area of interest. But I remember seeing this interview with him in 2014 where he said, we need to directly be killing as many Russians as possible in Syria. And I thought, what a fucking maniac. And the more I kept digging, the more I kept seeing, him showing up at Atlantic Council things. And lo and behold, everyone where I would see them saying something just fucking psychotic about Syria. A white guy who was born in fucking New Hampshire, who is he was raised Catholic and he's agnostic now, and he's saying the most vile, insane ethno-religious invective against Shia Muslims I've ever heard.
Yeah,
that all Atlantic Council people, a really fucking incredible body of work.
They're crazy. I mean, they're crazy. I mean, they've set up a new China Institute, so they're branching out in that respect. I mean, they're very influential. I mean, and this is interesting sort of, before the influential bit, I also wanted to say that they're huge on disinfo, anti-disinfo shit, right? And this is actually on their website. They say that our largest government donor is the United Kingdom, which supports our work studying and exposing disinformation, among other issues. So they see it as one of their key goals. And I mean, this is this whole 2016 Trump sort of obsession, right? This is a whole nother track that's also very interesting to talk about, where all these anti-disinfo organizations that were set up often in Ukraine, and then they spread out to the US. And then, as I said, like these anti-corruption organizations set up in the US, in Ukraine by the US, they were the ones that publicized the Manafort stuff, which ended up also being kind of not actually provable in Ukrainian courts. Anyway, so that's a whole one of their big tracks. But I mean, they're also really influential. I mean, for instance, James L. Jones was the chairman of Atlantic Council, and he stepped down in 2009 to serve as President Obama's national security advisor. And then, Susan Rice was ambassador to the UN. She also was a member of the Atlantic Council. Richard Holbrooke, a special representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan, is also...
Holbrooke is an all-star.
Yeah.
He is deep state first team all-star.
Yeah. And General Eric Shinseki, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Director of Policy Planning and State Department at the State Department. Hagel ended up serving as Secretary of Defense. General Brent Scowcroft served as chairman of the, and then he ended up being ambassador to China.
Wait, Brent Scowcroft?
Brett Scowcroft, yeah. So he served as interim chairman of the organization's board of directors until 2014, until former ambassador to China and governor of Utah, John Huntsman, was appointed to his position. Yeah. Sorry.
I've always liked Scowcroft as a Bush 1 figure, so it caught my ear.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a huge, and they have lots of also interesting scandals in terms of lobbying. I mean, they produced a report promoting the transatlantic trade and investment partnership between the EU and the US with the financial backing of FedEx that was simultaneously lobbying Congress to decrease tariffs between the US and the EU. They also had this big scandal above Chevron and ExxonMobil in terms of who were both sponsors of Atlantic Council, in terms of undermining the Brazilian legislative proposals to give Petrobras, pre-salt deposits in the Brazilian coast. So anyway, and also with the Arab world, they're sponsored by this guy. Maybe you know this guy the better, Baha Hariri, who's the brother of
the beloved Hariri family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and brother of the world's most kidnapped prime minister.
Exactly. And I mean, also Burisma funds Atlantic Council. This is one of the official, they donated $100,000 every year for 3 years from 2016 onwards. But there was this big thing when, basically Hariri got them to get rid of someone that was too, not militaristic enough about the Middle East. Anyways, they're a real piece of work. They're incredibly, obviously, always going for no ceasefire, war forever. They were incredibly pessimistic about Zelensky as well. When Zelensky was running in the elections, they had all these things like, oh my God, Zelensky's a Russian agent, end of the world. And in the first period of his time, they were very worried, like, is he going to reach out with Russia? And he's going to start, peace in Ukraine. This can never happen. But then they became more optimistic about him. And now, obviously, they're quite happy for him to stay in there. But they're very much allied with the sort of the Soros right-wing Ukrainian politics. Lots of these big figures write for them quite often, like Sergei Leshchenko, other people, NGO circuit. So, yeah, Atlantic Council. What a piece of work.
So, you've written extensively about how Zelensky, in sort of his efforts to salvage his presidency and forces that ended up being aligned with Zelensky, they made this calculation that it would be better to sort of align themselves with the Democratic Party at first, and now that is coming back to bite them in a huge way. It's always very interesting to me when people make those calculations of who they think is like inevitable in American politics, or if it's just a gamble. But now, obviously, they, this was an incredibly poor choice to make. It augurs incredibly poorly for his political future and possibly Ukraine at large. I was wondering if you could give a outline about what may be on the horizon for a settlement administered by Trump, who is sort of on deck next, because that would probably be the end of Zelensky, and what do things look like after whatever horrible deal we impose on them?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of funny because, I mean, I find it a little bit depressing about how Trump right now this is probably the only kind of cool thing he's doing. I'll be honest, right? In terms of trying to end the war in Ukraine in this just really stupid war, right? I mean, Biden from the beginning, he was clear that Ukraine's not going to join NATO. He would say that, oh, Ukraine has to have the door open, but they can't really join right now because they have some serious corruption issues, which was in Ukraine, you pro-Western people would point out, like, what about fucking Albania, right? Which has been in NATO since 2009. This is, it's not a fucking real country. I mean, let's be real. And it's way more unhinged than Ukraine. And Ukraine's unhinged as well. But it was obvious that they just didn't want Ukraine in NATO. And they were happy to refuse Russia's demands for a written refusal or a written closed doors policy for Ukraine. They didn't want to admit to that. That would be seen as weakness and so on. And they wanted Russia to sort of get involved in some kind of what they saw as a weakening exercise for Russia. But they weren't going to let Ukraine join NATO. Anyways, it was just a very obvious leaving Ukraine out to dry and suffer all the consequences, which didn't achieve the goals of, destroying the Russian army and so on. And now Trump seems that he wants to end this war. Maybe his own ambitions, Nobel and whatever. Maybe he wants to pivot to China. Who knows? But I just find it just really depressing, right? How in the U.S., among the sort of liberal media and lots of, left-wing media, this is framed as, oh my God, Trump, this is awful. Bernie Sanders, we need to protest this, right? This is good, right? Like, I mean, you can hate Trump, and Trump is obviously this, all these Elon, Trump, all these things, what they want for America, for the American society is unenviable. And, but in terms of Ukraine, this is not a bad thing, right? If elections come to Ukraine, if there's an end to the war in Ukraine, if people in Ukraine can go outside, like men will be able to go outside, right? It's a situation where people get shot at the border for trying to escape Ukraine, right? It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And if there are people in Ukraine that want to fight Russia, right? That want to, but I will note that, like, when there was the mobilization law in 2024, 6 million people did not enter their details. Only 4 million people did, right? To join the army by the deadline. And of those 4 million, many had medical conditions that would allow them not to serve. Although then those medical conditions made them viable to serve. And now you can have tuberculosis and HIV and still serve in the army. It's a bit of a big issue. But what I mean is most Ukrainian men do not want to serve in the army. They demonstrated this by not putting the details up to serve. Right. But in a just situation, they would be able to leave. And the people that wanted to serve in the army, they could stay and they could fight as much as they wanted to. Right. But that's not how it is. People get shot and killed on the border for trying to escape, or they die in the river, drowning in the river. They die hiking over the mountains. This is a huge genre of, like, YouTube videos. People explain how to, hike through the Carpathian Mountains to get to Romania. While you're being, watched by drones and possibly shot by border guards, by Ukrainian border guards, not by Romanian, by Ukrainian ones, to prevent them from leaving. Anyway, so I mean, I find it kind of crazy how this is framed as, a bad.
Well, I mean, I mean, like, with Bernie specifically, it is fucking incredible after everything I saw him do for the first, like, 15 or 16 months of the Israeli genocide to take umbrage with this. Yeah. But I do think the worry with a lot of people, both on the left liberal side and the more explicitly left wing side, is, to say the least, Trump's foreign policy is kind of all over the place, right? One moment it looks like, we'll use Israel for an example. One moment it looks like they are taking this sort of like like George H.W. Bush or Reagan approach where, okay, we're going to treat Israel like any other American ally. And even if that drives them fucking crazy, we're not going to let them dictate these terms, et cetera, et cetera. And then whoever's in the admin who has that point of view, Miriam will make a call and they're fucking out of there. And then they're doing X, Y, and Z fucking insane thing either on a domestic front as it relates to Israel, or just something with weapon sales or escalating with Ansar Allah. So who knows? I mean, as you pointed out, things with Russia and Ukraine got shittier under Trump 1, and he while doing this, he bragged about being the first guy to give them lethal weapons. And the other thing is too, I mean, people have pointed out that his mineral extraction thing makes no fucking sense as far as the realities of mineral extraction go. But it is, you know, you do generally worry, like, what other awful thing could be done to them.
For sure. I mean, like, look, in my perspective, I think as long as the borders open and mobilization, this was actually Putin's essentially demand now is that he's fine with a ceasefire as long as mobilization ends in Ukraine at that time. And the general Trump Putin thing is they want there to be elections in Ukraine, democratization and so on. And this would put in peril the nationalist militarist forces, because people are very tired of this, according to every poll in Ukraine, is that people are very, very tired of the war and of mobilization. And they would like an end to that. And so, I mean, that's and I think that's fine. You know, I mean, personally, I think if people can leave Ukraine, that's good, because I mean, it's awful. And I know people in my family who are politically well connected that left the country illegally in wartime because of their good political connections. I mean, I'm not me. I'm not a Ukrainian citizen. But in fact, it was actually, I left after they'd left. I left Ukraine after the members of my family that were legally meant to stay in Ukraine when the war began. They left early on, and anyway, I found it quite difficult to leave. But so I mean, what's being discussed now is that there was this Zelensky 10 days after his big argument with Trump, right? They had the new talks in Saudi Arabia, which Zelensky didn't actually participate in. So it's kind of, he went to Saudi Arabia, but he didn't participate in the talks. So I guess he was
he was like Christopher when they went to Italy.
That's right. Yeah.
He did too much heroin in the hotel.
That's right. In a little cast in his neck or something. Yeah. There's some crazy skyscrapers in Saudi Arabia. Maybe he was sitting in them in Riyadh or something and sort of contemplating. Yeah, I mean, there were long negotiations, 8 hours. I translated the thing by one of the diplomats that said that apparently they got really tired during the negotiations, and they may have made some big compromises during these negotiations because they got really tired. I guess it happens. But
that's genius. I mean, I would sell out my country or whoever if you got me tired enough.
After 7 hours, come on, guys, we got to wrap this up.
Yeah, Jesus.
Like, I'll do anything. Just let me get out of this fucking, I want to go outside. But I mean, really, I mean, I'm not sure what he means by that, because really what happened is that the end of these negotiations was that the Ukrainian delegation agreed to the idea of a ceasefire, right? I mean, they were open to the idea of a ceasefire, but I mean, which is a big contrast to their previous rhetoric, which is that no ceasefire is possible, blah, blah. But it didn't actually, there was no, they didn't agree to a ceasefire. They agreed to the idea of a ceasefire, and if Russia agrees, then sure, a 30-day ceasefire. And the hope that was voiced by many Ukrainian diplomats and government officials, and everyone in Ukraine essentially, there was a nationalist, freak, was that Russia will decline. They'll say, no, we don't want a 30-day ceasefire. We want Ukraine out of, no Ukraine in NATO ever, which is the Russian diplomatic line, which is we don't want a temporary ceasefire. We want a full peace agreement that changes the European security landscape, and NATO leads Ukraine forever. No more spy bases in Ukraine, which are, New York Times writes about these, that, CIA spy bases they had on the border with Russia in Ukraine. Anyway, so they were hoping that Russia would tell Trump, fuck you, we're not signing that, and then Trump will go ballistic and he'll give Ukraine nukes. Right? This is the idea.
Yeah.
That they're going to get Trump back on Team Ukraine by getting him to agree to some kind of agreement that Russia would never agree to, and then telling him, well, look, Trump, Russia's crazy. You got to support us. But that didn't happen. I mean, Russia replied that, like, yeah, look, we're not, this is not enough for us, but we're open to discussing this, but we need to have something more. And this has been the past couple of days. And so it's a little bit of a, I mean, the Marco Rubio and every single Western government official before they talked with Russia, after these Saudi Arabia talks, they all said, like, in unison, that the ball is now in Russia's park, or Russia's court. That's right. Lots of balls just flooding the Kremlin. But then they threw it back with a curveball. I guess I can say that, which is the saying that we're fine with this, but we need to have something else. And obviously, well, the two that have been mentioned so far is no mobilization in Ukraine, and something else. I forgot what. But it seems likely that Russia is asking Trump to push on Ukraine more, to give these different concessions around NATO, around elections, because Russia's very tired of Zelensky. They want someone else that they see as being more likely to agree. I think that Zelensky's basically gone a little bit crazy. He's an actor. He's been told for how many years now that he's like literally Napoleon, literally the Jedi's Luke Skywalker and so on. And he's kind of drunk the Kool-Aid a little bit, and he's lost touch with reality. Plus,
a true actor.
He's a true actor.
That was always the danger. Is I legitimately, I've always felt like there's an earnestness to him.
Yeah,
which is not always a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean, the guy, there's lots you can say about Zelensky. He's a very interesting figure, I think, world historically, very postmodern. And the guy had a TV show where he was the main character, where he became the president of Ukraine. This was 2018, 2017, and so on, which was being produced by Kolomoisky and so on. And that he's this amazing teacher that becomes the president of Ukraine, who stops corruption and so on. And then he became the president. And this TV show was really popular, and then he became the president after. It's incredible when you think about it, really. It's incredible. In the post-Soviet world, we have this term of like political technology. And there's this incredible political technology that took place with Zelensky. But so this is the situation at the moment. Right now, there's the opposition in, Trump is in contact with the Ukrainian different political factions. This is Politico has been writing about it, and other different Western media has been writing about it. In particular, with like the pro-West, the ex-president Poroshenko, who has quite a large party. Not that popular. He's not that popular at all, really. According to the polls, the ex-head of the army, Zaluzhny, he's the most popular, according to most polls. Zelensky got rid of him at the start of last year because he was getting too popular, essentially. And also they could blame the failure of the counteroffensive on Zaluzhny and so on. But then apart from those figures, Zaluzhny is also in contact with different, Azov people. They boast of their good friendship with him. One of the top Azov guys, Korotaev, he talked about how he gave Zaluzhny like a rare British colonial knife. They're really into knives, these guys, like cool knives and knife.
Like a Sykes-Picot fighting knife?
Some shit like that, yeah.
Sykes-Picot, yeah. I'm a fucking idiot. A Sykes-Fairbont knife. Sykes-Picot. The same guy that did
That's right, yeah.
The Sykes-Picot agreement
that he was
invented the knife.
That's right.
Oh my God. I have to clarify. I need to do a pickup at the start of this episode. On any existing subreddits, no one mentioned the Sykes-Picot fighting knife.
Maybe
now
it was
the dumbest thing I've ever said. It's the Fairburn Sykes fighting knife I'm thinking of.
Maybe it was the knife that Sykes-Picot used to carve up the Middle East, to carve up and give it out. And they carved the map, and that's how the knife came out.
Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. But yeah, anyway, so like he meets with Zaluzhny. He gave him a knife recently. Zaluzhny is the ambassador to the UK now. But there's also talk that actually Trump is not much of a fan of Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny recently came out with some anti-US statement, how like Trump is abandoning Europe. I don't know. I think everyone's saying that right now. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So sure how much Trump would worry about that. But more interestingly, I think is there's this faction of. On the one hand, Budanov, who's the head of the intelligence services in Ukraine, GUR, which is Directory of Intelligence and so on. He's actually in charge of like the Azov Nazi freaks in Ukraine. Budanov is really like the main kind of patron of these forces since 2022. And he's been saying stuff that we need to have a ceasefire, otherwise the country will collapse. He reportedly said this a couple months ago. And then he denied it, but like not really denied it. And anyway, basically he said this, that unless we have a ceasefire, the Ukrainian state will cease to exist by the end of this year. And that's a line that, as I said, lots of these Azov guys have been saying as well, that like the country is heading towards self-destruction. Unless we have a ceasefire, we can use this to sort of amp up the army, get things in order, put our guys in charge, get rid of this Zelensky idiot and so on. And then you have him, and then you also have this interesting guy, David Arachamia, who's a very, very interesting, very strange figure, he's the head of Zelensky's party in parliament. He's also got this crazy biography. He's actually from Russia, but he's like not like ethnically Russian, seems like some kind of Caucasian in terms of like the Georgia area. Anyway, he had he worked in the US in the 2000s and all these weird tech startup companies which were investigated by the FBI for massive fraud, but then they called off the investigation. And then there's all these kind of talk of CIA involvement. He's working with Microsoft, all these weird tech startup companies that failed, but then emerged from the ashes and so on. And then he went back to Ukraine in 2013, right as the, Maidan was taking place. And then he was kind of invisible, but then all of a sudden, 2019, he became like, meteorically rose to power with Zelensky. No one had really heard of him before. But he's in charge of Zelensky's parliamentary faction in parliament, which is really important because Zelensky's having lots of trouble with parliament. Parliament's not really passing his laws, or they are, but with like a very, very only just scraping through. The Ukrainian parliament kind of works with, you pay off people, $100,000 to vote for this or not to vote for this and so on. But in wartime, the money's not really there. And then also these laws are also unpopular, and all these parliamentarians, they're thinking about the political future in any elections. Like if I vote for this law, giving the mobilization police the right to shoot people, right? Like no one will forget this. Everyone will hate me. Mm-hmm. So they're not voting for stuff. Arahami is kind of in charge of disciplining them, but he's becoming more and more kind of alienated from Zelensky, and more importantly from like Zelensky's right-hand man, Yermak, who's kind of like the gray cardinal in Ukraine, and Yermak has like lots of hate for him as this weird like Russian spy, but he's also become so isolated in wartime as like Zelensky's number one man, maybe more powerful than Zelensky. He's kind of micromanaging the government and so on. And the Sorosite people hate this Yermak guy. But basically, Yermak and Arachamia are fighting. Arachamia went to Trump's inauguration, and he's talking with Trump about some kind of ceasefire, essentially. And he's allied with Budanov, this guy, the Secret Service spook guy, who's in charge of all the Azov, right-wing guys, different other weird Nazi groups. So that seems like a that's kind of what I'm, I don't know, betting on, but that seems quite legitimate. I think Trump has serious problems with Poroshenko. Poroshenko was the president when Manafort stuff came out, and Poroshenko was kind of involved in this Manafort stuff coming out in 2016. Not coming out, but kind of being produced, essentially, as an anti-Trump operation. Poroshenko's a real kind of Democrat Party guy. But I think Arachamia, this guy is a young, weird tech startup freak sort of guy. Sounds very Trumpian. He sounds very Trumpian. And weird sort of spook CIA stuff. So that, and weird crazy fraud, like, pyramid.
Yeah, he's like basically a teal guy.
Exactly. It sounds great. So basically, I mean, this Arachamia guy, he has a very important role in the parliament. As I was saying, I mean, the parliament's not passing Zelensky's laws, and Arachamia is in contact with Trump over a ceasefire. Budanov is in charge of like the neo-Nazi Azov people, and they're all kind of in favor of a ceasefire in which they would sort of purge society of any anti-militarist forces, get their, kill some more sort of fifth columnists, as they call them, and probably try and centralize their power in government. And then you also have the fact that, according to the Ukrainian sort of legislation, Zelensky's constitutional two-term limit has run out. and he would have to transfer power if there are no elections, he would have to transfer power to the head of parliament or some kind of parliamentary national unity government, which is something that the Poroshenko kind of ex-president, liberal nationalist guy, he's been talking about a lot. Because Poroshenko is not that popular, but as part of some kind of national unity government, that would kind of make sense. He would be able to get back sort of this close to power in that sense. And then there's the head of the army, Zelensky, who's apparently the most popular guy in Ukraine, according to polls. But I don't know how much you can trust these polls. I think lots of it is just people really tired of Zelensky. If you look at Ukrainian social media, there's loads of hatred towards Zelensky. People are just really, really tired of the current situation where you can't leave, and mobilization, kind of press gangs are prowling the streets and shoving you into buses and, beating you to death and all this sort of thing. Tired of the war, they don't want to fight, and so on. So it's a complicated constellation. But there were these talks in Ukrainian media that Zelensky was proposing to Trump that Zelensky become sort of what they said was like a Cold War style African or Latin American dictator, where the US keeps him in power forever, in exchange for which he's like this Cold War frontier state, and also he gives the US, natural resource benefits. But that seems like it's not really flown through with Trump, and Trump seems to want to exit Ukraine. I think he has very bad associations with Ukraine through Russiagate and all this stuff, and they're really into that, like the American, Republicans and so on, which is kind of obvious why, because, it got him impeached, right, in 2019. And that was also because of this phone call with Zelensky, where Zelensky promised that he would sort of prosecute the people responsible for the Manafort shit, right? And Zelensky said in this phone call, like, yeah, the general prosecutor is totally under me. He's totally under my control, 100% under my control, and we're going to look into it. But they didn't look into it. And then these Manafort era spook people, this guy Trepyak that I wrote about, they actually got back into power in Ukraine. And so Zelensky didn't fulfill his promise of looking into this shit. Trump is tired of him. So I do think that Zelensky's time seems to be numbered, but then there's definitely plenty of time for some kind of crazy false flag type situations. It was interesting. During the talks in Saudi Arabia, there was Ukraine's biggest ever drone attack on Moscow in the war during the Ukraine-US talks in Saudi Arabia. So there's clearly some kind of idea that, we can get Russia to really oppose these Trump's attempts at peace, and this will annoy Trump, and then Trump will be on our side again. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. At the moment, it seems like Trump is intent on peace in Ukraine, getting rid of Zelensky, some kind of elections. And then you have, I guess the last thing that I would say is that even though these Azov-type people, they want a ceasefire to clean up the country, they are quite worried about elections. And there was this interesting interview from a few days ago by this important military commander, Kirill Verez, who's this, he's not in Azov, but he's like allied with Azov. He's this commander of this drone unit. He's very popular in the media and the press. And he was talking about how it's impossible to get back to we can't take any territory. Ukraine's too weak. So we need to have some kind of ceasefire and sort of reorganize shit. And we're not making enough drones. Russia's making way more drones. But he also had this really interesting thing that he said, which is that if he were Russia, he would probably push for a ceasefire in Ukraine, because this would mean that Ukrainian politics would become more, but basically he said there'd be some kind of civil war in Ukraine. People would start hating military veterans, and there'd be some kind of large-scale civil unrest / civil war in Ukraine if there was no longer this external enemy of Russia to sort of unite society. And he said that in that case, Russia could easily take Ukraine after there's been this kind of civil conflict. So he seeming to imply that, like, we should not have elections. We should have some kind of military government. He didn't say this explicitly, but this is definitely something that Azov people like to talk about. Military government with us in charge. I don't know how likely that is. Maybe. But that in general, the liberal nationalist people, they're very worried that, like, Russia will use hybrid warfare to destabilize Ukraine during elections, meaning that, like, Ukrainians may vote for some kind of pro-Russian candidate, and Russian media will sort of encourage this, and so on and so on. So it's interesting to see where it'll develop from the future from now. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it is anyone's guess, obviously. When he says they could take Ukraine, what would that actually look like? Does he mean like literally absorb it as territory? Because I've learned my lesson about making predictions more or less, but like, I don't think they would do that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like, I agree in terms of making predictions. It's a very, very dangerous game. But look, I mean, so the whole thing before 2022, right, was this whole Ukrainian society. The whole big question was, will the Minsk agreements be implemented? And like the basic sort of question of that was the Minsk agreements would involve the return of Eastern Ukraine, controlled by like pro-Russian separatists, however you want to call them, into Ukraine's political world. And importantly, elections there would take place before the Ukrainian military takes control of that. This was an important part of the Minsk agreements, which would mean that like pro-Russian, anti-EU, anti-NATO figures would win these elections. And then already the Ukrainian electoral field was such that the pro-Western parties were not that popular. They got like 20, 30% of the vote, at most 50%, but generally less. And like the party that the Atlantic Council supports, right? This is the Golos party, Voice. They get like 5%. They're very unpopular. This is the Fukuyama supportive party. Actually, they were headed by this singer, Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, and he actually went to study with Fukuyama in Stanford when he got tired of politics back in like 2019 or so. And Fukuyama stated that he wished that Vakarchuk could become the president instead of Zelensky, because Zelensky is a Russian agent. But that didn't happen. Vakarchuk's a bit of a freak. He's just like he's a really shitty sort of like Coldplay style, like, but imagine that, but like nationalist sort of thing. Quite popular, I guess. Like, his early songs were kind of all right, actually, but he played in Russia a lot as well. It's like this usual sort of thing.
What kind of music was it?
I mean, it's like, imagine Coldplay, I guess, like that. His early songs were kind of a bit more indie sort of thing, and they were kind of, some of them kind of cool.
Modern arena rock.
Yeah, you guys should play one of his songs. I can send you one of his songs to play. Like for instance, the song like "Stреляй," which is like shoot, which was this thing, and Azov kind of used the song, but it's like a pop, but Coldplay style. But he was not that popular. No one really wants this crazy, like, neoliberal nationalism thing. And so then the whole feel was that if we allow these territories to return, people will vote for, like, the electoral balance will be such that we won't even be able to have any influence on Ukrainian politics. We'll have these, like, anti-NATO parties. They'll be in charge. They already have lots of vote anyway, but without these millions of Eastern Ukrainian voters. And if they return, then it's over for us. So, I mean, there's this big fear of democracy, ironically, among these liberal nationalist NGO types. There's this quote as well, for instance. I mean, like, there was the head of Internews, which is this media company sponsored by USAID and the Renaissance Foundation, Konstantin Kvurt, and he, like, for instance, last year, he was pushing for a law to outlaw or ban Telegram and regulate social media. And he said, to avoid being accused of obstructing freedom of speech, in quotation marks, all that stuff that leftists love to talk about, we need to refer to European practices where they know how to encourage technological platforms to cooperate. So they're very they think freedom of speech sucks. It's leftist, right? I mean, before 2022, there was this large scale kind of disenfranchisement of Eastern Ukrainians because they were internally displaced and they weren't able to vote in elections. And this was, quite a large chunk of the electoral landscape in Ukraine. But I wrote stuff about this. This was, lots of people wrote about this, open democracy and Western media as well, where the most kind of anti-NATO parts of Ukrainian society weren't able to vote. And this was supported by these, Sorosite forces, as they're called in Ukraine. And if there are elections now, there's this fear that, we'll go back to that. And then people will vote for someone that wants, basically to sort of chill. We don't need to join NATO. It's not going to happen anyway. And let's just sort of come to some kind of agreement with Russia. We don't have to like them, but we don't want to fight with them forever. Something like that. And that's their big fear, basically.
I don't know. I guess depending on what I think about that guy's music, I might start a foreigners campaign to elect him. Though if I don't like it, I mean, I'll keep uninvolved.
Well, because he was the other option other than Zelensky. Like in 2018, the Ukrainian oligarchs were like trying to figure out who should they get to replace the president, like because Poroshenko was taking too much shit and getting too powerful. And the pro-Western Pinchuk, more pro-Western anyway, he was trying to prepare Vakarchuk for this role. And he was like really glazing him on his media, his TV channels. But it just didn't really work out. Either Vakarchuk didn't want to, or he just wasn't popular enough. And then Kolomoisky decided, well, that's a great idea. And he started trying to prepare Zelensky, who was already a well-known comedian, for the role of president, and so on. So, I mean, maybe Vakarchuk has a chance. Probably not. He's kind of stupid. This is kind of his problem. He doesn't really have, and he doesn't seem to have that many ambitions, really. I mean, he's into music. And he's into like, I don't know, Fukuyama, I guess. But he doesn't seem that enthusiastic, I guess.
The only thing like more temperamental and like horrifying on a personal basis than an actor is a musician.
Absolutely.
Like I am terrified of people who are good at music for the most part.
Absolutely.
They're so maladroit at human communication. They have to learn how to do music.
Exactly. Well, can't you tell me what you think? Why do you have to sing about it? I mean, can't you just tell me what you want in simple words? Like, yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah.
I guess to close this out, and this is, once again, a fairly broad, open-ended question, but we touched on the Atlantic Council and the Western sponsors of a lot of these forces a lot. I was wondering, just from your perspective, as someone who's much closer to this on the other end of these Western institutions, of the Atlanticist designs, where do you see them going next after this? And I guess how do you see them characterizing this? Because I am very curious to see how they frame this in coming years. I think it will. They're going to go for like a stabbed in the back type thing with Trump and kind of bank on Trump continuing to slide in popularity. And I think that they'll try to sort of make anti-interventionism a uniquely Trump thing going forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Right now, you have this whole European thing of saying that we're going to continue the glorious legacy of Atlanticism without the U.S., and we're going to continue supporting Ukraine. But now, I mean, they keep on saying this, but it's obvious they're not actually going to follow through. And then they came out recently, and Macron and Starmer said, well, we're not going to put troops on the ground in Ukraine after they sort of said they would. And it's clear that they won't. I mean, the UK has one regiment or whatever, right? And all of the tanks don't work. They don't have the capacity to follow through with these promises. So the irony is that really, I mean, if Kamala had been elected, it's probably likely she would have been trying to pull out of Ukraine as well, really. I mean, Biden as well. And he was never committed to going further to do what is necessary for Ukraine to win. I mean, even what that would involve, who knows? But he was always limiting the. There was a lot of military aid, obviously, to Ukraine, but he also was very clear that the U.S. was not going to get involved directly, that they were not going to. They're going to keep it within certain limits. So it's kind of ironic because, I mean, I think that what Trump is doing now, it would have probably been done by a Democratic administration as well, probably in a more, kind of in a less extravagant, more, I guess, maybe hypocritical and like doublespeak sort of way, whereas Trump is just saying what actually is happening very directly and bluntly. But I think in the future, there's this speculation that it's part of this attempt, well, speculation. I mean, this is said openly by many, by like Marco Rubio and so on, that we have to orient towards China. And, there's like the Palantir guy, that freak, like that weird, young, annoying,
what, Alex Karp, or are you talking about the weapon Palmer Luckey?
Palmer Luckey.
Yeah. He's like a teal guy, and I would be sure that I'm almost certain that Palantir has some sort of business relationship with Anduril.
That's right. Yeah.
I hate that guy, both because of how he looks and like what he says, but also like I wouldn't call myself like an expert on weapons. I'm interested in them because I played Ace Combat when I was a kid and still do. But like his weapons fucking suck. Like I'm sure they're constantly being jammed by Russia. Russia jams them incredibly easy. He acts like he has cracked the code of like loitering munitions. No, you haven't. Fucking everyone who worked for like McDonnell Douglas or fucking whoever 40 years ago made better weapons than you.
Yeah.
The first cruise missiles we ever made to be fired from B-52s are less shitty than what you make now. I hate him. I hate his stupid fucking loitering munitions. I hate his stupid fucking cruise missiles that have like a 20-pound warhead. Yeah, anyone can make something go 200 fucking miles if there's nothing in the warhead, you asshole. Oh, God, fuck him.
Yeah. I mean, there was this interesting interview that from a couple months ago that I wrote a thing about where he was talking about how, it's this stupid sort of Silicon Valley like genius, like we just need more geniuses to fix the world and then it's going to be fine. And he's saying basically we're going to have these epic mega drones. I mean, not mega, but that will solve the war in Ukraine. And the idea being that we need to save money. There's too much money being spent on defense and that money needs to go to me. And I'm going to make these amazing drones that will be cheaper, but will actually be more effective. And it's kind of stupid where it's just, I mean, the way that drone warfare works in Ukraine is that the number of drones is really important. You need to have lots of drones because most of them will get jammed, right, by electronic warfare. So you need to have lots of drones, and Russia has been able to produce a lot more drones. As I was saying, this Veres guy, head of the drone, like the most kind of well-known drone guy in Ukraine, well, one of the most well-known drone guys. I mean, they're all talking about this. Russia has so many more drones, and that's why they're sort of winning the drone war. And Ukraine's often has this idea where it's like, we're going to have these genius high-tech drones, and they're going to win against the Russian orcs that have like a billion shitty drones made out of like, shit and like, sticks. But the reality is that the Russian drones are pretty, technologically advanced as well, but you need to have more drones. And there's this Palmer Luckey idea. I think it's very kind of this Trumpian sort of quick fix sort of shit, right? Whereas we're going to have some smart ideas, some good deals, and some Palmer's amazing, 5D porn, Oculus Rift type of situations. They're going to just solve the war. But obviously, I mean, warfare is a lot more, I mean, like military organization, the sort of larger strategy, and also, I mean, manpower. And it's not really just solved by these little amazing toys. But so I think that's an idea that they have. They can sort of semi-withdraw from Ukraine, but still maybe keeping it in their orbit as like a semi-neutral but also pro-American country. And this genius technology will help them with that, which seems unlikely to me. But, there are some other that say that Trump is fine with Ukraine just being kind of a neutral, even, Russian sort of satellite, who knows? And then, but then with, now that they can focus more on other things, they can focus and pivot towards China. And Palmer Luckey is also talking a lot about China. Not that Palmer Luckey kind of decides things, but I think it's kind of illustrative, I guess, of this.
Yeah,
these kind of
he's a good bellwether.
Yeah, maybe. And yeah, it sounds like, but like, so, I mean, that's, and I think it's interesting. I'm sure that the Atlanticist type people will be trying to sort of drag the U.S. back into Ukraine through some kind of stunts. Who knows how? Maybe. But it's, in any case, I think like the two scenarios are either Ukraine becomes some kind of neutral, chaotic political arena where there are lots of forces pushing towards like détente with Russia, but also lots of forces against that, like it was before 2022, essentially. Or there's some kind of large, or the war just continues. And then, I mean, Russia has better chances for a lot of reasons. And this could lead to like a much larger scale Ukrainian defeat, collapse. It's hard to say. I mean, you don't want to make any predictions, and the war could go on for a long time as well. But also, I mean, then it's the question of how much will the U.S. be supporting this war either as well. And I mean, how they'll frame it in the future, I think, yeah, like some sort of this stab in the back narrative, but also just forget about it. I think they'll just forget about it, honestly. I think that's how they do it. You know, they just say, well, who cares? It was the Ukrainians' fault. They didn't fight well enough. We helped them as much as we could, but then it was stupid Trump, stupid Ukrainians. I think that's how they'll spin it, honestly. And who cares about them anyway? A bunch of, Slavic subhumans anyway. I think that's how, and that's what kind of fucks me up. I think after supporting this so much and pretending to care so much about this country that they found out about yesterday or whatever. I mean, I'm talking especially about the sort of liberal Democrat like voters in the US or whatever. And but then they'll just forget about it, just like with every other war. I think that's a totally likely scenario, honestly.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the other thing that I've picked up watching them is it would be great if people internalize their failures such that they go, okay, we're done with politics. Fuck it. We're going to go back to making TV or whatever the fuck we did before. But they unfortunately do not let things, get them down, and they will move on to the next thing and the next thing after that. I think you're completely right that like those Palmer Luckey and other Teal associated types are a very good bellwether for what is next. And yeah, no, I'm sure it'll be China stuff. I don't know what that will look like, but I'm sure it will be something similar where you're an asshole and you're a hypocrite, and it actually invalidates anything that you've said about Israel, that you won't stand with Taiwan or whatever the next thing is.
I think the Philippines makes a lot of sense. Like in terms, it's like very similar to Ukraine, this kind of very corrupt country that's totally infiltrated by like American military and intelligence services and sort of shaping them up to be this future battlefield. But it's very sad, you know what I mean? If you think about the longer term, it's kind of this final stage of, what they called like Vietnamization, right? Where it's like we can't be involved in these wars directly. We need to sort of give it over to our allies / proxies, and they can do the killing and the dying and so on, and we'll be out of it. And it's sad, really, how this is not recognized, I think, by significant portions of the American left. There's plenty of people that see it how it is as well, but also, I mean, even I guess liberal critics of, say, like the Vietnam War or whatever, or the Iraq War or whatever, but then and something totally obvious is happening that's also incredibly sad waste of human lives for these objectives that are just so vague and so based on, I guess, national, this fear of appearing weak in the world and of maintaining, I guess, U.S. hegemony in this transforming world where there's not really a need anymore. Well, I mean, not a need, but there's not really the possibility for this to exist.
I was thinking about this the other day, how, the most like overused popular thing to say in the last few years is this idea of like nothing ever happens. And that's, obviously not true. Things happen all the time. The unfortunate reality is everything is set up, especially with this post-Vietnamization system. Nothing ever ends.
Yeah.
And even when, it's after someone's time in the sun, so to speak, is done, and they lose the privilege of Anglo-American institutions fucking up everything in their country and pushing them further and further towards death and destruction, and it's the next person's turn, the same people will be involved in the same institutions and the same ideas and tactics. But something did happen before that, and people died. Things lives were destroyed. Countries had their histories forever altered. But none of the people involved will ever fucking go away. And
Absolutely.
in fact, they will be in politics until they're 120.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I was just recently in Vietnam, and I was just reading as well about this, and it's really crazy, and it's incredibly sad how, people that, killed thousands or hundreds of people just personally, right? Different soldiers or generals and so on, and they just never faced any consequences whatsoever, and that's just how it is, and with politicians that'll continue to have this whole, self-aggrandizing sort of valiant view of themselves as, saving the world. It's pretty crazy. But I mean, I guess it was in Vietnam. It's nice. The country's doing well. That's cool. It's a bit of an exception, really, but it does happen.
Yeah.
But sad.
Yeah, that's the thing is like they got a conclusion.
Yeah.
Not that they got off light. They experienced some of the worst actions of America during the Cold War, but there was a conclusion there. And unfortunately, that is something that is absent in a lot of the rest of the world now. You know what's fucking sad is one of the only pieces of media where they acknowledge both the idea of American war criminals in Vietnam besides William Calley, both as something that existed and something that is directly something you interact with and part of the plot, and it is accepted that it's a good idea for them to face justice. It was Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes. It was a fucking video game with like 5 missions that last like 40 minutes. That's the only fucking piece of media I remember that even has that concept in it.
And how did they? What could you sentence them yourself? Or I haven't played this game. How did it work?
You go to like a Romana Clef of Gitmo, and you kill them. You can also abduct them, but like
awesome.
The guy, your guy who's like on the radio with you wants you to kill them. He's like, no, we need to kill them.
Wow. So you kill the American soldiers responsible for what, like burning and killing and raping a village. Wow, incredible. I didn't know that. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. Nothing ever ends. And I think with Ukraine, I think it's going to just continue in some, maybe not full scale war, but as the popular term is, this hybrid war, right? Because this constant threat of a new war erupting. And there's also just, there are so many people that are involved in this, that have fought in the war and become really, I guess, radicalized. Many people in the army want an end to the war as well, actually. Many people in the army are very tired of the war. But there are many as well that their friends have been killed and so on, or relatives of people killed in the war, many of them also want an end to the war. But many of them don't. Many of them, wanted to continue and are very, very committed to this. So I think it's just going to be smoldering and festering away. And you don't really have any groups in Ukraine that have a clear vision of where to take the country and in some sort of progressive sense that would keep people minimally happy and a clear idea as well. Because the thing with Zelensky, he just didn't have a clear idea and he didn't really know what he was doing. He was kind of reacting to short-term sort of things. He would try to do something good, but then the sort of the nationalist opposition would protest and they would stop him, and then he would back off and he would go the other direction. And so there's not really any forces with a clear idea. This is the big problem, I think.
Yeah. And of course, of those people who, were radicalized, and yeah, you make an important distinction that a lot of people, they got sent in the other direction of being against this war continuing in any future wars, but they have more weapons than they have ever had at this point.
Yeah.
Just kicking around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of, every other day you'll see some story where it's like, a guy throws a grenade into a crowd or like into a neighbor's apartment and kills 2 people, or like into, at his girlfriend or whatever and kills her. Or, yesterday or the day before there was an assassination of one of the most well-known nationalist sort of activists, as they're called, in Ukraine, in Odessa, Demian Ranul, and he was killed by a military man, a sergeant, who deserted from the army, and there's a video of him walking up to this nationalist freak who's a total piece of shit. But he walks up to him and he just shoots him, and he's on the ground. And he just walks up to him again and shoots him in the head, just close range, no reaction whatsoever, and then just walks away calmly. But there's so many people with guns. There's so many. I remember there was an interesting story 2 years ago or so back. These guys were smuggling all this ammunition from military guys, and then they got in a firefight with the police. They killed the policeman. They were on the run. They got captured. So, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, grim things ahead. Well, I mean, the only positive thing I could say as we close out is, I don't know, it'll be harder for us to get one over on China, I think.
It sounds great.
Not that we necessarily got one over on Russia, but, even more difficult to get one over
harder.
on China.
Yeah, I agree. I thought you were saying it, and now it's easier for us to turn to China, and now we're going to fuck them up.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah. Well, it seems like things are pretty chaotic. That's good. Things are going very strangely in the halls of power. That can only be good, right? I hope so. Although they have those scary buttons. That's not good. So who knows?
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks a lot for having me on, Felix. I really enjoyed my time on here. I hope I didn't talk too many names, but
no.
Yeah.
My absolute pleasure. I am really glad we got to do this. If people want to read you, where can they check you out? And yeah, if you have anything else you want to plug.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my Substack, Events in Ukraine. I definitely recommend subscribing to that. I put out 2 articles a week, sometimes 3. And yeah, I write elsewhere as well, but you can it's mainly on there. Yeah, all the best, Felix. Thank you so much.